Good morning, or good evening, or good afternoon to wherever you may happen to be tuning in from. Welcome to the BU Rising Powers Initiative's second event of the semester. For all of you who logged into our Rise of China event a few weeks ago, that recording is now available on our website and you can watch it from there. But thank you very much for tuning in today. I am delighted that we have a very different panel of experts, and the topic is, of course, the RCEP. And before I hand it over to my wonderful colleague at the Rising Power Initiative, Ambassador Jorge Heine, who will introduce our panelists and the panel, let me just tell you a little bit about RPI. So our mission is to understand why rising powers fail or succeed in terms of security, governance, and health, and to understand how they actually impact international order. And so our work is extremely interdisciplinary and extremely policy relevant. And we look at 5 countries or blocks. We look at China, of course, and we look at India, of course. And we also look at Brazil. But then we also look at 2 other blocks and countries that are really ignored when it comes to emerging power markets, which are ASEAN and Germany. And so our panels and our events and our work touches on all of these countries in 3 significant issue areas: security and cooperation, diplomacy and governance, health and human capital. And as director of the RPI, I can promise you that we have other fantastic events planned as well for this semester. So I hope very much that you will sign up for our mailing list and stay tuned for more such events this semester and in future academic years. So with that being said, I'm just going to hand it over to my colleague, Ambassador Jorge Heine.
Thank you, Manjari. Good morning. Welcome to the second RPI webinar. You know the saying, timing isn't everything, it's the only thing. Tomorrow will be the first leaders meeting of the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, better known as the Quad. President Biden will take part in it. The Quad is, of course, one of the centerpieces of Indo-Pacific strategy that has been put forward by the United States since 2017. The big question for tomorrow is whether the Quad should be considered some sort of Asian NATO, as some refer to it somewhat grandiosely, or whether, as a Foreign Policy magazine article put it yesterday, it will remain a bit of a talk shop. But the broader question that we'd like to address this morning, and that goes to the heart of what RPI aims to explore, is the shape of the regional system that is emerging in Asia today. That is by no means a question that concerns only Asians, with many arguing that we are at the beginning of what has been called the Asian century, by which is meant the century of China and India. This is something that concerns everybody. The notion of Asia-Pacific came into its own in the aftermath of the Cold War, and the founding of APEC is in many ways emblematic of it. Over time, the rise of the Asia-Pacific region came to be identified with what the World Bank has referred to as the wealth shift. That is the massive shift in economic activity from the North Atlantic, which dominated much of the 20th century, to the Asia-Pacific. This was not just because of the rise of the so-called Asian giants, China and India, but also because of the emergence of ASEAN and a number of other neighboring countries. It is estimated that by 2050, half of the world's product will be generated in Asia. And yet, just as we're getting used to looking at the Asia-Pacific as the new center court in international affairs, the one where everybody wanted to be in and perhaps even to play, a new term came up, that of the Indo-Pacific. Those advocating for it argue that we need a broader, more integrated vision of the region, one that brings not just one, but 2 oceans into it, that the shipping traffic through the Indian Ocean to East Asia is of such nature that it must be considered as part of a system and be integrated into wider geopolitical conception. Maps, of course, are in our minds, and names do make a difference. Interestingly enough, much as Australia pushed for the notion of Asia-Pacific in the late 80s and early 90s, it is also very much pushing for the notion of Indo-Pacific. But obviously, Australia by itself cannot take on such a task. India has to play a key role in it, in any such reimagining of the Asian region, and what the emerging Asian architecture will look like. But what triggered this panel was the signing of the RCEP on 15 November, and the fact that India dropped out and is not part of it. Can India play a key role in the newly emerging regional architecture without being part of some of the main regional trade pacts? That's a big question. Will ASEAN continue to play such a vital role in refashioning this regional architecture as it did with us, with the RCEP? And what would happen if China applies to join the CPTPP, known as the TPP-11 also, as President Xi said it might, and was reiterated in the 2 sessions in Beijing this week? Would then the US reconsider its relation with the TPP, which it ditched unceremoniously in 2017? So these are some big questions, and we are privileged to have such a distinguished panel to address them. We have with us Alice Ba, who is Professor of Political Science and International Relations at the University of Delaware. She has a special interest on the international politics of Southeast Asia and the politics of regional regime building. Her book, Renegotiating East and Southeast Asia, is published by Stanford University Press. She has held Fulbright Awards in Beijing, in Singapore, and was Director of Asian Studies at the University of Delaware. Sreeram Chaulia is Dean and Professor of the Jindal School of International Affairs at Jindal Global University in New Delhi. He is the author of a number of books on current affairs, including Trump, Emerging Powers in a Post-American World in 2019, great title, and Modi Doctrine, the Foreign Policy of India's Prime Minister in 2016. A prolific columnist on international affairs, he writes both for the Indian and the international press, and is also an active television commentator. Huiyao Wang is the founding president of the Center for China and Globalization, one of China's leading think tanks. He has a special interest in globalization and global governance. A counselor in China's State Council, he is also professor and dean of the Institute of Development at Southwestern University of Finance and Economics in China. He is the author of many books and has held visiting appointments at Harvard's Kennedy School, at the Brookings Institution, and at the Asia-Pacific Foundation of Canada. So, without further ado, let me pass on the virtual mic to Professor Ba. Professor Ba, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for those introductions. And thank you for inviting me to this panel and joining this illustrious panel. I'm always happy to take part in such an important conversation. So I was asked to give a brief introduction also to RCEP itself, and then with emphasis on ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. So RCEP, or the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, is the world's biggest regional trading agreement now, and was signed last November by the 10 countries of ASEAN, plus China, the region's largest economy, Japan, this region's second largest economy, South Korea, the region's 4th largest economy, and Australia, the region's 5th largest economy, as well as New Zealand. Together, the 15 participating countries represent about 30% of the world's economy and 30% of the world's population, covers a range of items, goods, services, investments, economic and technical cooperation. RCEP is one of 2 mega trade deals that has been signed in Asia in recent years. The other one being, of course, the comprehensive partnership, the TPP, right? The Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for the TPP. Both, it is worth noting, lack US participation. And as I'm sure most of us are aware, the United States was supposed to be part of the TPP, but of course pulled out. RCEP is an agreement in which the Southeast Asian states via ASEAN played a particular role in first spearheading. You know, we were discussing this before the panel started, that there is often a misconception about RCEP's genesis. And it's important to understand that RCEP does stand out in terms of ASEAN's initiative and the initiative by Southeast Asian states. It stands out also for being the most ambitious trade agreement negotiated by developing countries. It was first mooted in 2011, and then negotiations began in 2013. The foundations of RCEP and its developmental lineage can be traced to a series of ASEAN +1 economic agreements between ASEAN and its 6 dialogue partners over the course of the 2000s, right? And so ASEAN played an important role in facilitating RCEP's conclusion, both its initial negotiations as well as its conclusion last year. There are several points, I think, that are worth emphasizing as regards ASEAN's particular interest in RCEP, as well as its role in spearheading it. I'm going to highlight 5 reasons in particular. The first is that it does serve to harmonize ASEAN's different trade agreements. Again, as I just suggested, when RCEP first was initiated in terms of discussions and negotiations, they were building upon what had been separate ASEAN +1 agreements with its different dialogue partners. And so economically, RCEP serves to ease and support the flow of supply chains that connect Asia's different economies. And this is especially important for Southeast Asia's economies because they are especially dependent on trade for their GDP, their growth, and in their view, their stability. That concern about supply chains also, of course, factored large in the push to conclude RCEP last year. If anything, that concern was even more intense these last 2 years due to the US-China trade war, US decoupling efforts in Asia that destabilize Asia's supply chains, due to considerable questions about the degrees of US economic engagement in Asia, as well as the kinds of US engagement in Asia, and of course the economic fallout due to the global COVID pandemic. Those pressures made concluding RCEP even more imperative for the ASEAN states. I think Singapore's Minister of Trade put it this way, quote, RCEP is more than an economic agreement. It is a strategic signal that to the rest of the world that this part of Asia continues to believe in upholding a global multilateral trading order, unquote. I'll come back to this point as it is related to my next one as well. A second reason for Southeast Asia's particular interest in RCEP regards the major power dynamics and rivalries in the region. There are two major power dyads, okay, that are of concern here. The first major power dyad of concern is between China and Japan. And specifically, especially when we look at the genesis of RCEP, it was a compromise between, two proposals that were also being pushed by China and Japan. And so it's worth underscoring that RCEP and ASEAN's role in RCEP was partly a response to those two competing proposals. RCEP today, it is worth underscoring, right, thinking about that particular major power dyad, that RCEP today is the first and only preferential trade agreement between China, Japan, as well as South Korea. And I don't need to remind most of us that those are relations that have been fraught in recent years, and been challenged in recent years. And so for ASEAN states, it's significant. RCEP is significant not just because of the economic importance of all three economies, but because the tensions between them also affect the regional stability of the larger region. The other major power rivalry, of course, is the one between the United States and China. And so much of the US approach to trade in Asia under the last two administrations has been framed in opposition to China. This wasn't just the Trump administration. The TPP, when it included the United States under the Obama administration, took a particularly strong role in setting and pushing the TPP agenda. And the TPP was widely seen and often presented as a strategic tool targeted at kind of distancing or reorganizing some of these supply chains. And so, for those who remember, Obama's Secretary of Defense, Ash Carter, characterized the TPP as being as important to him as an aircraft carrier. And, and as we all know, the Trump administration was also especially explicit in pursuing unilateral economic initiatives aimed at decoupling China from the US and others. RCEP in this context importantly signals a strong interest on the parts of ASEAN states in maintaining and guarding against the disruption of existing trade ties. On the part of ASEAN states, at least, RCEP signals the belief that whatever challenges they may face, for example, with China on other fronts, it is also not in their interest to cut China out. A third reason for ASEAN's interest in RCEP is the concern about ASEAN itself, right? And specifically, we can talk about the developmental divides within ASEAN. ASEAN's role assures consideration of its least developed economies, okay? Addressing the developmental divide between ASEAN's more established economies and who are also not coincidentally its founding members has long been a concern of the organization. But in the context of intensified, trade negotiations in Asia and trade competition in Asia, concern about the developmental divide also takes on additional significance. For example, in the case of the TPP, and again, we have to kind of think about RCEP's genesis in that TPP context. In the case of the TPP, popular commentary often emphasized that TPP did not include China, and that's true. But we forget that TPP also did not include more than half of the ASEAN members. Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia face particular challenges in participating in arrangements in what the US calls kind of these gold standard agreements or US style trade agreements. And so it's very difficult. And it's also difficult for the United States, to be quite frank, to also negotiate with those states. ASEAN-led agreements, by contrast, allow for greater flexibility and training, flexibility in accordance to developmental levels. And RCEP does provide provisions also to assist some of those more challenged economies. Finally, a fourth reason for Southeast Asia's interest, particular concern in RCEP, is what they call ASEAN centrality. And specifically, in taking initiative, ASEAN seeks to quote, and this is quoting from their declaration at the launch of RCEP, ASEAN seeks to, quote, affirm ASEAN centrality in the regional economic integration process. ASEAN centrality refers to ASEAN's interest, or perhaps more accurately, its dual fear, its dual insecurity, that number one, that ASEAN states and the concerns of the smaller economies in Asia will be sidelined in favor of much stronger economies and their interests. And second, the second insecurity or second fear being that Southeast Asian states might become casualties of intensified major power conflicts and competition. And so those fears make RCEP and ASEAN's role in RCEP important. The particular emphasis on regional integration as a response to the uncertainties of the global economy, to the uncertainties of global politics, to the uncertainties of US policies, is a historical theme when it comes to ASEAN's regional integration efforts. As smaller economies, RCEP's inclusion of the larger Northeast Asian economies is really important because the larger economies help better position smaller economies in the global economy, and again, assures that they have some input into not having a divided Asia. Let me conclude with a comment on the subtitle of this webinar, namely, is it the Asia-Pacific or the Indo-Pacific? I think that there are a few points worth noting on this Southeast Asian angle. First, India's withdrawal, I think, underscores, in fact, one important challenge of the Indo-Pacific conception, namely the economics. Southeast Asian economies and political systems live and die by trade. India's economic integration with others was already relatively less than the others are to each other. And so that raises a lot of questions on the parts of ASEAN states about, for example, India's economic integration with the rest. Second, let me just simply say that this doesn't mean that India is not important to the Southeast Asian states. I think it's fair to say that most in ASEAN see India's withdrawal as a lost opportunity. But the fact that negotiating states, not just ASEAN states, but also the others, but the fact that they went ahead with RCEP anyway, I think also tells you that they can no longer wait for India to get on board, right? So is it Asia Pacific or Indo-Pacific? I think the answer is that there are elements of both. Regions are fluid. We are making them and remaking them all the time. There are some ideas that are more fixed, more firmly rooted in practice and in our imagination. The Indo-Pacific is a strategic concept. It is not yet an economic one. So I'll conclude it at that and cede the floor.
Thank you very much, Professor Ba. That was a wonderful introduction to this very significant regional integration scheme that is the RCEP. And I think you laid the ground very well for Dean Chaulia, who will now take the mic and give us his perspective on this, one of the great topics of our time. Dean Chaulia.
Thank you, Jorge. Hello, everyone. I think regionalism is indeed a flavor of our times. My previous book actually was centered on the idea of rising powers carrying their respective regions with them and consolidating integration of different sorts and to be able to then use those to create a multipolar world order. So I think when one talks about RCEP, I think it was a promising idea. And now that it's been signed, it's become a reality as well. But what has happened, in my view, and this is, of course, a mainstream view in India now, is that we are just not ready to join it on the terms of negotiation that happened. So if you go back to the multiple rounds of discussions that were going on about the specific items for liberalization and for tariff reduction, for harmonization, and so on, India did not abandon the negotiations until late last year. So they've been at it for a number of years and had been haggling over specific points. So I think the first point is that we were expecting greater access to service sector of the rest of the RCEP negotiating partners. And because, as you know, trade strategy, negotiating strategy is always based on one's respective comparative advantage. So there, compared to the remaining members, especially the more industrialized members, who are the majority in RCEP, India is not a heavily industrialized country, doesn't have a large manufacturing base yet, although Narendra Modi has been making a lot of effort in the last 7 years for manufacturing an indigenous industry to take off. So in goods, basically, India is defensive and vulnerable. And what happened and what people don't realize often is that when one says that India is out of RCEP, if you actually look at the membership, like Alice was mentioning, there are already FTAs between India and 12 of the 15 RCEP members, except Australia, New Zealand, and China. India has pre-existing FTAs with everyone else, including Japan, South Korea, and ASEAN. And these are operational. So the sticking points really, I think one was the services access, and the other countries were less willing to open the doors for our Indian techies and bankers and all these people who are generally very competitive globally. And the second was the whole question of the three countries with whom we don't have FTAs, but with whom we've already piled up large trade deficits because of the lack of competitiveness. Even in agriculture, we don't have large scale commercial farming and such things, unlike Australia and New Zealand. So and China, of course, is a far more industrialized country than India is. So the deficits that we were running with almost all the trading partners made it politically impossible for Mr. Modi and his government to sign it as it stood, as the negotiating terms were. India has not foreclosed its door yet, and it insists that we want a fairer bargain. So that's one. Then, of course, there are questions. I know many people are disappointed internationally The Japanese wanted us in, the Koreans wanted us in, ASEAN wanted us in. Um, uh, but then, there are compulsions, and what had to happen was, India basically saying that we will look for other means to continue to be engaged regionally. And that other means increasingly is turning out to be this idea of the Indo-Pacific. And here, like Alice was saying, the economic glue is not as strong as in the case of the Asia-Pacific idea, which is essentially now RCEP without the US. But then the Indo-Pacific is supposed to be a more geopolitical idea based on sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the fear of Chinese hegemony. So that has really taken off in the last few years. And like Jorge was mentioning, there is a Quad summit happening for the first time at the initiative of the Joe Biden administration. Japan is there, of course, and so is India. But if you look at the map, the Indo-Pacific, the four members, the core members are all only the rim countries of this region, meaning they are at the outer edges. The heart of it is ASEAN and the Pacific Island countries. And they do remain ambivalent about the idea of Indo-Pacific. ASEAN, I think Alice mentioned, they did issue something called an outlook on the Indo-Pacific some time ago. But they are indeed careful not to ruffle feathers with China, with whom they have massive trade and investment flows. So I think, and then there are extra regional countries that are being sought to be brought into the Indo-Pacific. So in that sense, the idea of Indo-Pacific is not a closed one, except if you take aside China, keep aside China, which is like the 800-pound gorilla and the largest player in the region. Then you have a question of, it's actually an open architecture. In the sense it is meant to create a broader balance of power in the region. So in that sense, but there are some new initiatives that are coming up. One is, for example, the supply chain resilience idea, and to create alternatives to dependence on China. Because last year when the pandemic happened, almost all the countries in the region found themselves dependent on the Chinese protective equipment and medical gear and all those things. And some years ago, you may remember that Japan also found itself in a quandary with the rare earth minerals. Because of their territorial dispute, China actually blocked export of rare earth minerals that were firing up the Japanese industry. So resilience and diversification, I think, is a need. And on that front, the Quad and the Quad Plus, there is an attempt to bring in the Europeans also. The Europeans have recently signaled an interest in coming in. Germany has its the idea of an Indo-Pacific outlook now. Germany has issued one. France already has a full-time ambassador and a full permanent envoy for Indo-Pacific. And the UK is talking about an Indo-Pacific tilt. Now, one may argue that, these are just, people latching on to the idea and they don't belong to the region, right? Well, even the US doesn't belong to the region, technically speaking, although it's got a Pacific on the West Coast, but it's not really from the region, but it has got military bases, it's got alliances, it's a so-called resident power in the Pacific. So I think one thing that the Indians are trying to do is they do realize that there is disappointment due to us not joining, among a number of not joining RCEP. So they're trying to compensate, and you see it's quite enmeshed and intertwined. You find like a lot of overlaps of membership. So you have some RCEP members who are also part of TPP. You have Indo-Pacific construct adherents who are also part of RCEP. So it's a kind of a, what do you call it, like a soup bowl, I mean, lots of like mixed things mixed up. and there are no clear lines. I think the one clear line, of course, is are the rivalries and the competition among the regional and the extra-regional powers. So I think there is also now, I'm told that the Quad members will look for Quad Plus and try to bring in Indonesia and Vietnam especially, and which have, long-standing territorial disputes and anxieties about Chinese hegemony. And the second thing is they're also going to try and create these supply chains for vaccines by financing India, which has got the lead in vaccine production, manufacturing, and distribution, so that it remains the main savior, so to say, for the pandemic infected world. So the idea is that these countries will all pool in resources and will try to promote. So there are some, and then there's a talk about 5G networks, on which again there's been a lot of sensitivity about China, and about creating alternatives and giving alternatives to countries in the region. So these, when they scale up, the Japanese have an infrastructure project of their own, what they call Partnership for Quality Infrastructure. The US has a Blue Dot network. India wants to be involved in all these. So it's not going to be a military alliance for sure. There will be military exercises and such things because of the major threats being posed by China in the maritime domain to a lot of smaller countries. But there will be a lot of other initiatives that will come along. And then I think, you see, the APEC is now almost 40 years old. Sorry, more than 30 years old. And Indo-Pacific is just about taking off. It's in its infancy. But, and a lot of this actually depends on how China responds, because what we have seen in the last 1.5 years, or 2 years, what Xi Jinping calls a major country diplomacy, that has been, quite aggressive, or quote unquote assertive, as some people call it, in a milder tone. Now that is increasingly, now you look at RCEP itself. Although RCEP has been signed, you have members of RCEP against whom China has imposed unilateral tariffs and gone on offensive against them for other reasons, which are not justified in a trade sense, and which could actually lose if there was a WTO arbitration. Now, Australia, for example, has signed RCEP, is part of RCEP, but in the last 1 year, because of the pandemic and the politics around that, China's gone after Australia quite aggressively, with all kinds of tariffs on Australian exports and other restrictions and limitations. So this punitive side of China, I think, unless it's moderated, it will be difficult to stop the momentum of the Indo-Pacific. And Indo-Pacific will have two elements to it. RCEP cannot have a military element to it, because China does not have alliances, right? China only has partners. So the military coordination element will never come in RCEP. But Indo-Pacific has the potential of having both legs, because the US alliance system, and because India also increasingly is moving towards what we call strategic partnerships with Japan, and other countries in the region, extra-regional ones too. Now, Russia, I just want to stop with one factor, which is Russia. Russia has been on and off the radar. And as you know, India has been trying to convince the Russians to also adopt an Indo-Pacific outlook and to come back into this region. They were naval powers during this during the Cold War period. But from the Vladivostok side, there's a connectivity now coming all the way up to Chennai, the south coast of India, and the far east of Russia, crisscrossing this whole region. But Russia, because of its economic difficulties and because of its European orientation in terms of security, and Middle East orientation in terms of security, is not convinced. And of course, Russia is also dependent on China. So there are some of these other players who have assets in the region, or who could come back in the region. So I think it's a work in the progress. While not closing our door to RCEP, I think the way going forward is to find balance. And in fact, our foreign minister, Dr. Jaishankar, has written an amazing book called India Way. And what he says is that the search for a stable balance of power in Asia is our #1 priority. So there is a greater emphasis on national security and on sovereignty and on protecting weaker countries from debt trap and from hegemonic threats. So I think a lot of these countries don't see the US as a hegemon anymore. I mean, those are bygone days. And because the US has withdrawn, and in fact, people are doubtful whether it will even be committed to this region as much as they used to in the past, because the isolationism, it's not just Trump. I mean, I don't think even Biden can really bring, if America is back, but it cannot really play the kind of, sheet anchor role that they used to do in the past in the whole region. So in that sense, I think because the US is less threatening now, except for China, no other country sees the US as a major threat in this region. So what is happening is these countries are now more open to being involved in these kind of minilateral projects. So Indo-Pacific, I think, is going to be a reality, and a lot of it depends how deep and strong it will depend on the Chinese response to it. Will they moderate their conduct, or will they actually be like a red rag to the bull and go on more of an offensive, which has been happening in the last couple of years or 3 years? So I think that's the big variable to see how far this Indo-Pacific will fructify. Indo-Pacific, I don't think, is simply a fiction. All these ideas about region and regional integration are based on power politics and balances or perceived balances. So I think if you see it in that sense as a politico-economic construct, then I think it's got legs and it's got a future. And perhaps ultimately the rise and or decline of powers in the region will determine which of these visions, Indo-Pacific or Asia-Pacific, will ultimately prevail. I mean, right now it does look like Indo-Pacific is still behind in terms of finding the coherence and the formal institutions, while Asia-Pacific has got an older history to it. But I think the rise of India, if it bounces back economically, right now it's struggling. India is struggling economically. It's not been able to bounce back the way China has since the pandemic. So I think going forward, the power balances and how individual major power centers will rise or decline will determine which of these visions. What I'm presenting is more like a realpolitik refracted version of this regionalism, where emerging powers will have to carry these things, these concepts. If emerging powers are weak, or if are in decline or crumbling or internally unable to form a coherent policy, then I think these structures will struggle. Both of these will depend really on the important vectors or nodes that carry regional orders forward. Regional order depend upon powers and power centers. Is not a purely horizontal thing. So leadership will matter. So I think India cannot be written off, but definitely right now it's a little on the sidelines. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Chaulia. And with that, I now give the mic to Dr. Wang. Dr. Wang, the floor is yours.
Okay, great. Thank you, Ambassador Heine. And also, I'm very pleased to join this RPI webinar, which I think it's a really great initiative. And particularly, I think I'm interested in this new definition of the rise in power, with China, India, Brazil, ASEAN, of course, and of course also Germany. So it's really an interesting combination. I'm really hope that this series continues. So the topic actually we have today, I think that is really interesting. I mean, I'm quite fascinated by the discussion. And first of all, I think that we are actually coming to the Asia Pacific economy is really taking on. I mean, Asian Pacific, as as Mr. Chamir said, 30, 40 years now. But basically, economically, it's a miracle. It's a success. I think ASEAN is a great example. It was more than half a century now. ASEAN is really stand out as really a great economic success stories. So, ASEAN, China, Japan, Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. I mean, the RCEP. I think that we actually come into a very interesting area, and with the pandemic, with the protectionism, with the trade war going on for the last several years, and with the deglobalization, then we still manage to really, with also the marginalized of the WTO. I mean, Asia Pacific, particularly ASEAN initiated, and China, Japan, Korea, Australia, and New Zealand will be part of this RCEP, which, as Professor Bai said, it represents 30% of the GDP of the world, the largest free trade agreement in the world. It's amazing. It's really, I think it's a revival of the regionalism, of the multilateralism, and also of the globalization drive. So I think this is really something we should cheer for that. And which I think it's also great. It's a strong injection into the economy, which suffered heavily of the pandemic. As we all know that, being the Second World War, being the 2008 financial crisis, the trade and investment always the best medicine for real recovery. So I think we should really have the spirit of the trade and the of the investment as well. So just like for the last 75 years, we see the world actually in trade, in prosper. That's where we'll be able to avoid the Second World War. We cannot avoid a pandemic virus, war now, but we actually avoided the human fight, actually a massive fight in the last 75 years. So what I think is the RCEP is really great, and China and ASEAN and other countries has really worked very hard to that. Even though it's a pity, we see India is backed off on that. I'm quite pity to see that, because I think that India is a great country, has a huge potential. I mean, it's a little bit like China. I mean, when China 20 years ago, when even 35 years ago, when China started to negotiate join a GATT, a WTO, it seemed the same story. They worry about foreign company, too much competition, big elephant in the China house and things like that. China auto industry would be wiped out, and domestic industry will be finished. That was, and the wolf is coming. Basically, the slogan then is, if China joins WTO, the wolf is coming. But look, since China, this year exactly, China has joined WTO for the 20 years now, and China has actually, very successful economy. China's GDP has gone up 12 times, actually, become the largest treaty in the world. So I think, some kind of competition, some kind of international arrangement would be really great. So that's what I would say for India. Why not welcome this kind of open and maybe can stimulate domestic economy as well. So that's my first comment on RCEP. Second, I think I want to say that it's really a great story. I mean, during this changing of the government of the U.S., while Trump is defeated, you see the RCEP is being signed. You see this comprehensive agreement with investment treaty with EU. European Union has been signed between China and the EU, again, during this period, at the last day of 2020. So it's really amazing to see that. But also at the APEC summit last November, President Xi has officially actually announced that China is interested to join CPTPP. So, which is a TPP, I think George knows this very well. I mean, he is one of the TPP 11. I remember when President Trump put out of the TPP in 2007, we actually, 2017, we actually, our think tank has issued a report saying China should join TPP then, TPP, when US put out. But it was a lot of opposition in China, but we managed to build up the consensus. Now China finally convinced they should join, even though TPP was designed by the US. But the thing is, what they think is that China now has come to a state they don't really, not afraid of competition. We encourage competition, so that they think there's obstacles, like IPR protection. China is really now the largest patent applicants in the world now. They have only IPR to worry about. So it's really in China's interest to have IPR, but also data flow. China has a huge data. Data is the gold mine of the 21st century. Why worry about data flow? So again, there's a liberated mind on that as well. And also environment. China attaches more environment standards now probably than any other country. China actually set a target now to the 2060, before 2060 for carbon neutral. And also labor standards. China really, the labor law is very restricted. A lot of high standard has been applied. China can, also even with negotiate with EU, this has been brought up, and ILO standards, China probably will follow on that as well. And also finally, SOE reform. China never said they're not going to SOE reform. Probably competitive neutrality would be adopted somehow. So I think China is really looking forward higher standards of negotiations and look forward to joining CPTPP. Again, actually at today's news conference at the National People's Congress closing, Chinese Premier Li has actually been asked again, would China be interested to join TPP? Actually, Premier said, no, it's not TPP, it's CPTPP. China would be very interested to actively consider that. Actually, just said today. So I think this kind of open arrangement, and China, through the WTO experience, they felt this is great. That the more this kind of agreement they can have, it'd be better. So I think there's a revival of the multilateralism. There's a revival of the trade liberalization and investment. And also, I would encourage China to really start to be, to continue the investment treaty with US, where they left with Obama administration. So which is going to help China. And so I think, even for the US, I'm sure US will come back to CPTPP. Let's talk on that. So rather than they talk on multilateralism, maybe for higher standards of trade system, so that they can really push for the WTO reform as well. If on the digital economy, on the IPR, on those investment and the environment and the labor standards. So if you reach higher standards, they're going to service trade, they're going to really promote the WTO reform as well. So I think it would be great to have that attitude. And also China is actively pursue with this China trade agreement. I'm sure it probably will come soon on their agenda now, and also that I think this is going to help improve the China-US relations. I know that Chinese foreign minister and also Chinese top leaders, top diplomats, actually going to meet Blinken and next in this month actually in Alaska. So I think they are in dialogue. I'm glad to see that. Even President Xi and President Biden had a 2-hour telephone call before the Chinese New Year, while President Biden said Happy New Year to China. So I think I see a little bit quite different attitudes probably. The U.S. new president is adopting. They pursue more pragmatic, more professional, more down-to-earth attitudes. But finally, I would like to say about this Indo-Pacific. The Indo-Pacific, I think it's an interesting idea. It's a new idea. I would actually agree with the Indian Foreign Minister Shankar. I met him. We were at the same panel in Delhi a few years back when he was still working for Tata, and we were both of us on the same panel talk about China-India relations, and we felt there's enormous potential for China, India to collaborate. We are two biggest, most populous nation in the world. I mean, we have so much in common. We have a large population, urbanization, infrastructure, climate, environment, you name it. All the experience China has. India going to go through it again. So it's really pity that I don't see the two countries collaborate. I mean, now even get sometimes relation is not really that great. But I'm glad to see from Mr. Wang just two days ago when he had a news conference, was still would like to collaborate with India. Maybe we should really resume, because two oldest civilization among that. So I think it's really great that we should consider that. Even Indian Foreign Minister said, they view Indo-Pacific as an economic arrangement. They don't want to really make it a military. So I think that is really not really a good approach to really pursue that as a geopolitical, or maybe Quad or NATO of ASEAN. That's really not really fit the multilateralism, I think, era. I think now we are in the 21st century, not the Cold War, not the Soviet Union days. So I would think that Indo-Pacific would be great if it's economically linked with Asia-Pacific, with Asia, and China could be part of that. Maybe if it's really expanding. So we have ASEAN, we have India, we have Japan, Australia, and China could be in the future a major player in Indo-Pacific economic new circle or whatever. So I think if we look at them, put this as an globalization, regionalization forward, Asian and Indian Pacific, Indo-Pacific should work together. I mean, the two biggest oceans should be connected economically. So I would really view that as economic alliance of the future vision. Hopefully we could work towards that, rather than we build into an Asian NATO. So that is really going to be very dangerous, I think. So I will probably stop here. I really hope that this kind of discussion dialogue we can have more, and to really have a fruitful discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wang. What I would like to do now is, and I hope you bear with me, very briefly, give the mic to each of the panelists 2 minutes to respond to some of what their colleagues have said, and then we will move over to the Q&A period. Professor Ba, 2 minutes. I can't hear you.
Sorry about that.
There we are. Yes, there we are.
Yeah, so I mean, I'll say something about ASEAN and the Quad, I guess. And then I might have something to say about the US as well here. But on the Quad question, I think, as already has been suggested, I think it's a much more difficult question and for the ASEAN states. I think, just as India's not being part of RCEP doesn't mean that it doesn't have, other participation or other economic cooperation with the other states. Similarly, the ASEAN states need not be in the Quad, right, to also cooperate strategically with other powers. And so, they participate in other U.S. military exercises. They also, of course, cooperate in newer exercises, but also with China and others, Japan and Australia as well. So, I think, it need not be the Quad is what I would say. I think, as was mentioned earlier, I think there was a reason for why Southeast Asian states, even though this was a debate within ASEAN, right? I mean, there wasn't immediate consensus about it, but, ASEAN did initiate, an outlook on the Indo-Pacific, which is largely pushed by Indonesia. And so I think it's really important to understand that, again, from the ASEAN states standpoint on the Indo-Pacific, I would argue that there is an argument for the Indo-Pacific. There is an argument for greater economic as well as strategic cooperation, but maybe not on the current terms.
Thank you very much. Dean Chaulia, 2 minutes.
I think the issue of geopolitics cannot be swept aside, you see, because you now have a nationalistic revival, not just in Asia, but around the world. And even though Trump lost the election, the point is, if you take a broader scan of the global horizon, the return of geopolitical, so-called 19th and 20th century ideas is undeniable, no? And so I think in an ideal world, if every country were behaving, without throwing their weight around and without imposing their will on weaker countries, then we can talk about, horizontal, integration and all that. But power politics is back, and in many ways, I don't see it receding, but it will continue to accelerate. So that cannot be wished away. In fact, China is the biggest practitioner of power politics in our region. And if you look at ASEAN, China actually does not want a unified ASEAN on a lot of issues. It may want a unified ASEAN for trade, but there are two factions within ASEAN: the one so-called pro-China group, and then the one which is challenging China on sovereignty issues and territorial disputes. So China actually prefers a unilateral, in fact, bilateral channels much more than multilateral. Just because China is part of RCEP does not show that it is leading the region or anything like that. So I think that, and that's rational for China because it has power asymmetry and advantages over others, and it will find it easier to bargain and get better terms on bilateral basis than if whole of ASEAN or whole of Pacific Island countries became a larger group. So I think everyone is playing power politics, but sometimes these are disguised to make it look like win-win cooperation, and we are all doing South-South cooperation, and everybody, we a new type of international relations. Well, if you believe in new type of international relations, then why are you pushing around and poking countries over territorial disputes? Why don't you back away? So I think regional integration depends on a different spirit. Right now, it is still, as I said, driven by power politics. And sooner or later, I think these concepts, Indo-Pacific or Asia-Pacific, will depend on whether the powers, regional and the global ones, can find accommodation and some kind of coexistence, basis to coexist and draw red lines as to what is acceptable, what is not acceptable. Then I think, you can see a more of a liberal kind of a construct of all countries, joining hands and benefiting from mutual cooperation and all that. Until that time, I think we have to be cognizant of the underlying politics. You can't take away the politics and just focus on economics. I mean, that's just unrealistic, certainly as per the current global trends and the future ones that I see. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dean Chaulia. Dr. Wang.
Yeah, thank you, George. I think that like it or not, the rise of Asia is going to happen. The Asian century is coming. Asia will be of the 50% of global GDP, not very soon. So now China is a leading engine for that economically. China is already the largest trading nation with 130 countries. China just finished the 13th five-year plan. China has launched the 14th five-year plan. By 2035, China going to double its GDP again. And so China will be a global magnet for economy. China has a 400 million people, middle class, now the largest class in the world, has lifted 800 million people out of poverty. Again, China will going to have a huge market potential. So I think what China does now, pursue multilateralism. They reiterate, they really support RCEP. They want to have a free trade with EU investment treaty. They are willing to join CPTPP. So all those good, I think, they take probably a little bit high ground because they're willing to collaborate with every other countries. I think ASEAN would not take a stand like what Singapore Prime Minister said. And they're not going to be in the US camp, they're not going to be in China's camp, but they are not really interested in geopolitics. So what I think is that, the common sense will prevail. I mean, pandemic fighting is another good example. The China is now, 724, whatever, everything is normal here. Everything is really back to normal. You see how effective it is, how highly efficient the Chinese economy are. So we have to realize, China will be the low engine for the world. China has already contributed over 30% of global GDP growth. In the pandemic last year, China contributed 50%. So the world, developing countries, European countries, many countries will actually need China, economically. And I don't see that how we can really wage a geopolitical alliance against China, the largest, probably the most attractive market in the world for the decades to come. We have to really be realistic. Life, bread and butter is the most important thing. We can't live on the gum and powder. So let's face it. I think we have to be realistic. And of course, China would always love to peacefully coexist. And I think sooner or later the world has to understand better the system of China. You can, Fukuyama said it's not the end of history. We have to tolerate a different model. We have to tolerate a different system. If the shoe fits China fit well, I mean, why not let it be? So if that can really make a prosperity for the world, we have to be really a bit more tolerant to that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So we will now open for questions. I have a first question for Dean Chaulia. And this is on the notion of the Indo-Pacific. And does the Indo-Pacific strengthen the idea, the notion of spheres of influence, or does it contribute to its elimination? Dean Chaulia.
Wow, that's a really complex one. I think Indo-Pacific is multilateral. First of all, we are talking about large numbers of countries coming together and pursuing some shared values or interests. So I don't think the sphere of influence is generally for a power center, and which has got like a hub and spokes, and it's got followers around it, and they all obey the major powers preferences and go along with them. So in that sense, I don't think Indo-Pacific is, like I said, that because the US is not seen as a hegemonic threat anymore, except by China, no other country in the region sees the US as a threat. So there's no possibility of any kind of single country being a magnet around which the iron fillings will all gather and fall in place. So I don't think the Indo-Pacific is for spheres of influence. I think what they're trying to do is to rectify an imbalance of power. So in that sense, there is an existing or an attempted sphere of influence by the most dominant country in the region, which is China. And there is an attempt to counterbalance it. So if at all, Indo-Pacific is the antidote to sphere of influence. At least that's how we conceive it. And there's very little possibility of it going in any other direction because, like I said before, the commitment problem of the US, and India cannot be a hegemon on its own. It's still economically much smaller than China. So there's just no way any of the other member countries, Australia, Japan, none of them can actually amass so much power and concentrate so much influence that they can set up a sphere of influence via the Indo-Pacific. So I think we should take the Indo-Pacific as an endogenous thing. It's not really a US agenda. If those of, the Chinese believe that, but actually if you look at it, the US is not a central player in it. In fact, the US has been reluctant in the past to be part of it, while others wanted it in. So once you take that out, there is no threat of any spheres of influence. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. I have a question now for Dr. Wang. The question is the following. China aspires for regional integration, and given that context, RCEP is a significant milestone. But at the same time, China has grown increasingly assertive, especially with its territorial claims. How do you think these two apparent contradictions can conciliate? Dr. Wang.
Okay, thank you for the question, which is a very interesting question. And I think that, people maybe have sometimes, very often in the US and the West, People have a lens on China. When they talk about China, they still think about China 40 years ago, 30 years ago, or 20 years ago, or China didn't converge to them, to their model. But look, China has a 5,000 years history. It has its own development path and the culture, logic, and all the probably its own path. So we have to really understand, the internal logic of that, and look at China in today's lens. I mean, China's GDP already gone up since China embraced globalization many 20, 30 times. So China is a little bit assertive. It's probably understandable. You can't expect China is always like in the old days. But on the other hand, China is not really, that comes along with more responsibility. So China is helping, for example, China has supplied vaccine to almost 56 countries now. President Xi pledged $2 billion in helping WHO and many developing countries on fighting COVID. And China is doing all those good things, I suppose. But also, I see President Biden also pledged $2 billion at G7, which is great. I think if China and US work together, we will see much a better world. Also, the question regarding the territory dispute, I really don't see that much, because if you talk about Taiwan, I mean, Taiwan is part of China, always historically. If you talk about South China Sea, I mean, China never said, those are the freedom of navigation is always there, and China wants to work with ASEAN, for the code of conduct of peacefully joint exploration, whatever. So it was never really an issue. I mean, they can solve them among China and ASEAN countries. We don't really need other countries to intervene. Let's talk ourselves. So I think that there could be some other instance as well, but I think both sides should be restricted, maybe more rational, and we can avoid that. I mean, let's have more economic collaboration. So I think I still trust that economic integration will greatly dampen, will greatly reduce the geopolitical risk. So that's why I proposed Indo-Pacific be an economic alliance of some kind. I mean, including China could be part of that. So that's probably the right direction. Let's hope really for more economic. That's really the pattern we see after Second World War now. I mean, 76 years now since Second World War, we are still in prosperity. We haven't really have a big fight, so except fighting COVID-19. So let's continue that path. Let's improve the globalization, enhance globalization, and enlarge the globalization. That would be my point. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Wang. I have a question for Professor Ba. My question is the following. It has been said of Korea that it is a shrimp among the whales because it is located, in the geopolitical context surrounded by China, Russia, Japan, the US, and it must deal with this very challenging environment of these big powers. I suppose something similar can be said about many of the ASEAN countries located between China and India and dealing with this very challenging environment. Yet ASEAN has been extremely successful in dealing with this diplomatically, commercially, and you have studied this extensively. And it seems to me ASEAN is in so many ways a showcase, a model for other smaller countries around the world on how to make the most of numbers and of working together. What would you say, Professor Ba, is the secret to ASEAN's diplomatic success in getting the RCEP in place, in being able to engage superpowers, big powers, on their own, these 10 countries that have made so much headway, not just in trade, but also in diplomacy? Professor Ba.
Yeah, so I have a couple thoughts about that, and then I also might want to address some of the points that were just made by the last two speakers. Sure. I think, part of, ASEAN does, I think, as you've suggested, play a rather unusual diplomatic role in Asia, right? As kind of the convener or convening framework for different diplomatic and economic networks, right, as well as strategic networks. I think partly it is, of course, the states' commitment themselves to not being sidelined, as I said. I mean, if you look at the history of ASEAN's engagement in these processes, it initially started a little bit reluctantly because they have quite a lot of problems of their own to also take care of. But partly, I think, I'm not sure that it's difficult for, I think, maybe in a different area for similar powers to kind of play a similar role, because I think the conditions in Asia are also quite distinct. Where you have several large powers and none of them actually have the same kind of convening power. I mean, that would be one way to kind of think about ASEAN's diplomatic role. And, it is true that, as we see with RCEP, I think RCEP is the most recent example of this, but, we can also talk about other frameworks as well. ASEAN has ASEAN states, and certainly some states have pushed the other states to do so. To play a much more active and proactive role, because if they do not, then they will be vulnerable to all the great power dynamics that they would rather not be vulnerable to, right? So, so I guess that's my long way of saying that, I think some of it is certainly initiative on the parts of ASEAN states, but I also think that it reflects the distinctive conditions. I do want to just kind of address very briefly also some of the comments that were just made. I agree actually with some of the points made by both the other panelists. I think on the question of China's contradictions, I do think that this is an outstanding problem, in terms of foreign policy contradictions. I think it is hard not to ignore them, in terms of what this region looks like, right? And I think, it was said that the Indo-Pacific was in some ways an antidote to the spheres of influence argument. Certainly from the ASEAN states' point of view, if spheres of influence means dominance by one power in any area, that's a problem. And so it uses these diplomatic frameworks to, again, bring in various powers. I think I also agree that economics is very much emphasized on the parts of ASEAN states as the path to security. But that having been said, I think mutual insecurities do have to be addressed.
Very good. Thank you. So I've got another question that I would like to give to all of the panelists. The question is the following. The region was called Indo-Pacific by the British once before in the past. Do you think this revival of Indo-Pacific in name will fade once again? Is it due to reluctance to challenge hegemons? Din Chaulia.
Yeah, sorry, that's news to me. I didn't know that the British had coined this term, if it was true. Well, the thing is, it will not fade away because, when the British, if at all they coined it or they thought about, there was Curzon. Lord Curzon was a British, Governor General, and there's a so-called Curzonian foreign policy where from Delhi or Kolkata, the British tried to, manage a whole maritime empire, crisscrossing Africa and Asia and all that. So maybe that was their notion of Indo-Pacific. But I think after independence, India does not have a colonial bone in it. I mean, in fact, it's a status quo country. It does not covet or demand territories of other countries the way China does, for example. So it's got zero territorial disputes with any of its neighbors or extended neighbors. So India is very content in that sense. So I don't think this Indo-Pacific having India more involved in the architecture and shaping the architecture of the region will in any way lead to that outcome. So I think there is no, and India as an independent country will make its in such a way that it doesn't, the idea will not vanish because it needs it, and so the region needs India and India needs the region. So in that sense, I think Indo-Pacific will remain valid, but it all depends on, as I said, the waxing and waning of the fortunes of these countries, including India, in terms of their economic vitality, their growth, and their ability to be net providers of security and prosperity in the wider region. So those are challenges. And if those don't get upheld, if Japan continues to be in an economic funk and declines due to aging and other things, if India weakens, if Australia falls through because the commodities cycle has busted, then you can, foresee that the main legs of Indo-Pacific are, internally shriveling. Then you could foresee that it will fade away. But I don't think it's a colonial idea, and I don't think it can be compared to the British era, because this is a much more, as I said, a multilateral and horizontal idea.
Thank you very much, Vincent. Dr. Wang, same question.
Yeah, I think that really it's up to the substance of the concept. I mean, for example, we have this concept of the BRICS countries. I mean, even though it doesn't really make any geopolitical, geographic sense, it's still popular. Now they even have a summit for that. So it really depends on the substance of that. If it's going to be a Asian NATO, if you really want to borrow the idea of the Second World War or Soviet Union era and think that in that way, it's going to be, of course, I'm sure going to be probably past tense. It won't last very long. But if we really want to make it a new concept, let's enrich it, let's enlarge it, let's have China in it, let's have an Indo-Pacific, Asian, India, and Indo-Pacific collaboration. Then that may be a new multilateralism, new larger regionalism. That will work, and that will be new BRICS, or maybe just like we have this webinar, which rising power, including ASEAN and Germany. So it depends how you're going to, really define it. If you really think of this as a military or geopolitical tool, it's going to be failed. But if you think about this as a new concept to really unite the region, to really integrate the region economically, it will probably be successful.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Wang. Professor Bob, same question.
Sorry, I couldn't press the button correctly. So, I think, my response to this is partly that, it gets back to, again, kind of building off of Professor Wang's point earlier. I think it depends on the content of what this concept looks like. I think there is an argument for Indo-Pacific integration and greater Indo-Pacific collaboration, but the content matters. If it is going to be, defined in terms of, let's say regime dynamics, then it's going to be a problem or a challenge for several states, I would argue. That having been said, I also think that, there are, the status quo is destabilized, right? The status quo has been destabilized. And so everybody's trying to navigate through that. And so I guess I'll just conclude it with that.
Very good. Okay, so we are now nearing the end of our time. And I would like to give 2 minutes to each of our speakers to give and share their final thoughts. What's in a name? Indo-Pacific or Asia-Pacific? Dr. Chaulia.
Well, it's been a really engaging debate, and this should continue. I think if you go by the theory of constructivism, then these names that are these terms that we coin become self-fulfilling realities through socialization and through more countries joining in and believing in it. The world is what we make of it. So I think in that sense, it's work in progress. Indo-Pacific is work in progress. Asia-Pacific, I think the idea will be ultimately subsumed by Indo-Pacific because although Dr. Wang is saying that China would want to be part of Indo-Pacific, but China actually does not like the term Indo-Pacific, and it has refused to accept the term. and it says we should only use Asia Pacific, because China says that Indo-Pacific is a US imperialist project. But as I've explained, none of these countries which have joined in are necessarily doing it at the behest of the US or as junior partners of the US. So we have our own mind and strategic autonomy and independence. So I think in that sense there is room to be hopeful about Indo-Pacific. And ultimately Asia Pacific was of an era when India was very backward and was not a major economy. Today is the 5th largest economy in the world. So despite the economic protectionism, the trade protectionism, which is a problem, which is domestic in nature, and despite the lack of manufacturing, is still the 5th largest economy in the world. And if you see the IMF projections in the next 10 years, if it sustains a strong rebound from the pandemic, it will become the 3rd largest economy in the next 10 to 15 years. So in that sense, and if you use the purchasing power parity, PPP is already the 3rd largest economy in the world, behind US and China. So I think in that sense, this has got gravitas, this idea to bring India into the picture, because India was not even admitted into APEC. APEC, since creation, was not admitting India, saying that you are not meeting the trade liberalization criteria. So that was exclusionary. But now we see this as inclusive. Of course, from a Chinese point of view, Indo-Pacific seems exclusive because it's keeping China out of the picture. But Asia-Pacific was exclusionary from an Indian point of view. So you see how the way we are approaching it is a sharp contrast. Ideally, we should get along. I think if we can solve, reduce the geopolitical tensions and reach a consensus not to violate, territorial integrity or to attempt to unilaterally change the status quo, we could go back. And BRICS and other things are good things where we are both members. So it's very important to, I think, look at these ideas in terms of Miles's law, where you stand depends on where you sit, or something like that. So
That's right,
I think,
yes.
and it's a great panel because each of us is looking at it from different angles. And I think for a neutral audience, it must be truly fascinating. So thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, it's the basic law of bureaucratic politics. Where you stand depends on where you sit. Dr. Wang, 2 minutes, final words.
Yes, thank you. I think this is really a very, stimulating discussion, and I think it's very, very timely organized. Thank your center and also Ambassador Heine. I would say, that again, the Indo-Pacific, Asia-Pacific is a concept. It's already a reality. It's a success. ASEAN is a great example. So if we can enlarge that, become Indo-Pacific, that'd be fine too. So what I would say is that the reason China doesn't like that is, I think they have a kind of a tune. We already have FIs, or we have whatever. So if you're just using that as a geopolitical vehicle, I think that is really not serving its purpose. But we really should expand that to an economic mechanism, so that we can have many more economic mechanisms. We even have a Shanghai Cooperation Organization as well. India is part of that probably. So I think we could really make all those organizations more economically driven. You go to secure more peaceful world, rather than we're always thinking everything is more on the geopolitical side. I would really prefer that the economic integration that's going to continue after the zigzag we had in the last few years for the trade war. But I hope that where we have a much fair world, we have a WTO, we have a CPTPP, produce some more accurate standard rules, so that all can benefit. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doctor. Okay, Professor Wang, you get to have the last word.
Okay, my last word. Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific. I think, again, it's a little bit of both. I think we are seeing some shifts. There's fluidity, I think, as was already highlighted. But I do think that when we talk about that concept, we cannot also ignore what's going on in the United States, right? In that sense, the economic piece really does matter. I think it's clear that the United States is still very much interested in engaging strategically. We see this in terms of the scheduled Quad meeting, for example. But we haven't had a lot of signaling, right, in terms of the American economic agenda right now. And that's going to also affect the content of what the Asia-Pacific looks like, as well as what the Indo-Pacific looks like. And, as some have said, and I would agree with this, that if you don't have an economic strategy in Asia, you don't have a strategy. So I think that that's an important actor that we have to consider here in terms of what the Asia-Pacific and Indo-Pacific look like.
Thank you very much, Professor. Well, with that, let me thank our stellar panelists for this excellent discussion, which speaks very much to what RPI, the Rising Powers Initiatives, is all about. The world is being reshaped, and Asia is very much where the action is in today's world. And we have all learned very much from all your perspectives, and we much hope that we will continue to be able to count on you in the discussions, publications, seminars that we will continue to hold. Thank you again, and have a great day or great evening, wherever you may be.
Thank you to everybody.
Thank you.